Although Martin Luther King's stance on the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War caused dissension among some members of the civil rights movement and also tarnished his relationship with President Lyndon B. Johnson, diplomacy was of little importance to King as he was not willing to compromise his values for what he believed in. The civil rights movement was a struggle for social justice among Black Americans as they fought for equal rights occurring primarily throughout the 1950s to the 1960s. Segregation and discrimination against Black people continued to impact Black citizens in schools, work, transportation, and most aspects of their everyday life. Violence and prejudice sparked the ongoing fight for equal rights, and Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most influential leaders during the ongoing racial battle during the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1956 was Martin Luther King's emergence into the civil rights movement, as he was seen as a prominent leader after around 40,000 Black bus riders and the majority of Montgomery's usual bus riders boycotted against the system.
I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
26-year-old Pastor Martin Luther King was elected to meet at the Montgomery Improvement Association to demand the continuation of the bus boycott until a change was made.
All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet.
The first-come, first-served seat policy, as well as the employment of more Black bus drivers, pushed the movement into the right direction. In 1963, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined with the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights in an action campaign to attack the city's segregation system by pressuring Birmingham's merchants. On Friday, April 12th, King was arrested in Birmingham after violating the anti-protest injunction and was kept in solitary confinement. During this time, King wrote the letter from Birmingham jail. Dr. King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference were also planning the March on Washington since the late 1950s, this time to march for freedom. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people participated in the March on Washington near Lincoln, fighting for employment. King's I Have a Dream speech came to be known as one of the most influential speeches of the entire 20th century.
My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
The speech was monumental as it sparked attention from Congress as well as the President Lyndon B. Johnson. The NAACP, as well as other peaceful protesters among Martin Luther King, such as Roy Wilkins, James Farmer, and Whitney Young, drove Johnson to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the National Voting Rights Act of 1965. Soon after, tensions between the United States and Vietnam began in 1965. The United States wanted to avoid a superpower showdown, so they adopted a new policy of limited war. The U.S. entered the Vietnam War in order to avoid the spread of communism. Even before Johnson had begun his troop buildup in Vietnam, Dr. King was calling for a negotiated settlement to the conflict, telling journalists, "I'm much more than a civil rights leader." King argued that his capabilities were not constricted to the civil rights movement, as global conflicts impacted change within the movement. Martin Luther King did not find the United States' involvement efficient or useful for the nation or its people. He compared it to the drastic times in World War II to emphasize his point, saying that the United States tested its latest weapons on Vietnamese peasants just as the Germans tested out new medicines and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe. Wealthier people, government officials, and people who were supporting war efforts were not the majority of the people doing the actual fighting, leaving the poorer side of Americans to fight the war and suffer the consequences. Stanley Levinson was a Jewish attorney from New York and worked alongside King prior to the Montgomery bus boycott. He and King developed a close relationship where Levinson not only advised King but assisted with administrative demands of the movement. In early 1967, when King became determined to participate in a public denunciation of the Vietnam War, Levinson urged him to refrain. Levinson thought that King's planned speech beyond Vietnam was unbalanced and would have disastrous consequences. He was concerned over King's involvement in the anti-Vietnam War acts, and in particular the effect it would have on the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's fundraising campaign and King's personal prestige. He gave his speech anyway.
Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money, like some demonic destructive suction tube.
The civil rights movement was reaching new success, especially for those in poor communities. The poverty program allowed for a real promise of hope, but as the buildup of tensions with Vietnam arose, the program began to eviscerate and drain the country of resources that were being taken from poorer communities, making the rehabilitation of impoverished communities near impossible. Men were enlisting with the hope to benefit war efforts, but this suction tube of a war challenged the successes of not only poorer black communities, but the population of black Americans as a whole. Protesters stated, "We won't fight another rich man's war." As a man of peaceful protests, Martin Luther King felt the deep obligation to stand against the war, even with both friends and federal politicians in opposition. Money spent on resources for the war, such as weapons, took away resources from welfare and places improving society to use them for violence. King did not see the separation between speaking on the peace and civil rights as separate causes. In his Beyond Vietnam speech, he stated, "We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem." Stokely Carmichael was a chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who challenged nonviolence and alliances between different races, calling for black power. Martin Luther King and Carmichael agreed on publicly speaking on the opposition of the Vietnam War.
You do not think he's capable of committing genocide against us? Check out what he's doing to our brothers in Vietnam. We're talking about our survival and nothing else. Whether or not this beautiful race of people is going to survive on the earth. They have sent the missionaries in. We sent them out. They have sent the money in with the poverty program. The Vietnamese and the Koreans are pulling the money out.
King knew prior to protesting the Vietnam War that it could strain his relationship with President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had played an immense role in his civil rights movement. Johnson was an avid supporter of the civil rights movement, stating, "Their cause must be our cause too, but it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome." King proceeded to speak out against the violence in Vietnam, while Johnson continued to increase the number of troops being sent out. Despite Johnson's support towards King, in 1967, the disagreement on the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War forced King to remove his support from Johnson's candidacy. King prioritized what he believed would be best for the nation. With the issue of poverty still prominent in racial inequity, persisting African American sanitation workers sparked the dispute with Memphis city officials, which began in 1968. Around 1,000 workers refused to work in demand for higher wages, safer working conditions, and recognition of their union. Martin Luther King agreed to lead a nonviolent protest, but not too long after, around 200 participants broke storefront windows and looting transpired. The violence led to a citywide curfew and the mobilization of 4,000 National Guard troops. King wanted to resolve this issue by leading a peaceful demonstration 2 months after the first strike. On April 3, 1968, he gave his speech, "I've been to the mountaintop."
And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
One day later, something dreadful happened.
Martin Luther King 20 minutes ago died.
Is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
Shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King, who lived by nonviolence.
King's dream of transforming American democracy did not come to a demise with his death. The end of his life brought to light issues with violence, poverty, and injustice in society as citizens continued the peaceful fight in his honor. Despite all of the people fighting for Martin Luther King Jr. to refrain from speaking on outside matters from the civil rights movement, he fought for global justice that he felt did not supersede civil rights in America. King knew that black people would never be truly liberated with issues such as poverty still present. King said, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." He was driven by a mission greater than himself, which led millions of Americans fighting for peace within war, injustice, and lack of equality. Anti-war protests, peaceful marches, and the continuous fight for equality in America was the greatest legacy King left. He chose to fight during times of adversity and used challenges to fuel his passion for justice. The Vietnam War ended in 1975, with King's dedication for peace and resilience influencing society to this day to speak up against injustice. He said the hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. Change can only occur when you choose to speak up, and as King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter.